The index considers over 40 indicators of fraudulent activity, including property misvaluation, identity data, occupancy and employment income misrepresentation, non-arm's length transactions, property flipping, straw buyers, silent seconds, and concurrent closing schemes. Okay, and there are 4 subcomponents to the fraud score. The first subcomponent is the property value, so is the appraised value accurate? Then there's identity, is the true identity of the loan applicant stated, and, as is the credit information accurate. Occupancy, is the applicant misleading about the intent to occupy the home? Income, is the income properly stated? And then the 4 specific indices are based on subsets of the indicators that are relevant to each type of fraudulent activity. So this is a comparison, by the way, of Florida, this is the 4 components of fraud for Florida. So it shows that the top line is property value, which seems to be an important one in contributing to the fraud score in Florida. And we can, by the way, we can see that in 2007, after coming down, the property value fraud sub-index seems to blip up again. This slide compares Florida to Nevada and Nebraska. So the line that's the lowest in terms of the fraud index is Nebraska, and we're comparing it to Florida and Nevada because those are 2 states that had a mortgage problem, and surprise, surprise, they also had much higher fraud index than a state that did not have a foreclosure problem. Okay, now this is the property value index, and it compares Florida, Nevada, and Nebraska again. And we see that, again, that Florida and Nevada are way above Nebraska in terms of their fraud scores. So the idea here, the moral of the story is, and by the way, I believe that fraud played a huge role in the financial crisis. The moral of the story is they could have been using data and using some models to predict fraud, and they weren't. And, there was an underwriter from Washington Mutual who was interviewed by the New York Times earlier in the year. And one of the things she said was that she would deny loans, and then her managers would come and put pressure on her. They would complain to her supervisors, and they would come around and put pressure on her to approve the loans. And she said there were some applicants where she could tell that if you look at the picture, it didn't correspond, the house in the picture didn't correspond to the house in the loan on the loan application. Addresses didn't correspond. And in one of the applications that she denied, they went above her and got it approved. And 6 months later, the loan was in default because the house didn't exist. So, and they tried to blame it on her, but, she had the documentation that she wouldn't approve the loan. So again, they could have, if they wanted to look for and find the fraud, they could have. In a lot of cases, they didn't. Okay, now the next part of this is to just show that I personally believe the data that the mortgage companies and the credit companies had available to them could have been used to model foreclosure and delinquency issues, but it wasn't done. Okay, now in order to just do an illustration of what could be done, I took the HMDA data I used the census tract code to map that to a zip code. Now, you have to keep in mind the mapping is not one-to-one. There's a little bit of fuzziness there, but I had some software that did as good a job as could be done. So I mapped it to a zip code, and then there was, you'll see on this overhead, a website where I downloaded some data that was put out there by a nonprofit organization. The organization rated each zip code for the magnitude of their foreclosure problem. And they actually had 3 different items of information that I was interested in. One was the foreclosure problem, another was the subprime plot problem, and a third was the delinquency problem. And they used the information that they had to produce a score. So that it's, the thing of interest to us is sort of the ordinal relationship. I don't actually have foreclosure numbers, I have a score. Okay, so these are some statistics from once I had all this data merged together for Florida. These are some statistics for the subprime component score, the foreclosure component score, and the delinquency component score. So you could see that there's quite a spread, even in one state. Okay, so I thought I'm just going to show you a few of the trees that I ran in this. And by the way, I intentionally did some things to keep what I'm showing you small enough to put on an overhead. In this first tree, the interesting thing that comes out that I'll mention later on is that the percent of loans approved in the zip code is related to whether or not there's a subprime problem. So the higher the percent approved, and the statistic that's of importance to us, by the way, is this one. It's the ones are, I took that original subprime score and I essentially used the distribution to cut off the top 10% and create an indicator variable, which is 1 if it's very high on that score and a 0 otherwise. So you can see that where there was a high approval rate in the zip code, there was a relatively low rate of having a subprime problem. And then a couple of the other variables that are showing here as being important. One is the interest rate spread, and as you can see, a higher interest rate spread, a higher problem. And then we had, there's a percentage of the population that is not 1 to 4 family housing. In other words, it's something like an investment property, or it's something other than a few families living in the housing. And the lower that one is, the higher is the rate of having a problem, at least when you go down this category of the tree after having a low percentage of approvals. Okay, this is just one where, in addition to the variables I mentioned so far, there was one more zip code database I incorporated into this, and it was one that had some demographic variables like from, I believe, probably the 2000 census. There's some kind of income and population related and et cetera demographic variables, and okay, it's not showing up well here, but if you go a little further down the tree, actually the amount of population in the zip code does end up being predictive also. Okay, this is where it's shown. You know, I did 2 kinds of trees. This is a shade tree where when it splits, you can split on more than two-way split.